Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Ernest Hemingway's short story, Indian Camp. This is a story that I was requested to do a video about, along with George Orwell's A Hanging and Chinua Achebe's The Madman. I was requested to do this by some students, or a student technically from Morocco, because they are studying these stories. So, this is it's a strikingly similar, sort of broadly plotted thing to George Orwell's A Hanging, in that you have a journey to a particular location, you have a dog or dogs that interrupt the proceedings at an inopportune time and are driven away. You have at least one character who dies, and then you have a sort of survivor's high that wraps up the narrative. I'm not saying that Orwell, whose essay came out after Hemingway's story did, stole Hemingway's themes or anything like that, but it is a somewhat striking similarity that of the four pieces this Moroccan student was studying, the other one being Jean Rhys's, I think The Day They Burnt the Books, two of them have such similar thematic elements. I think that's interesting in itself. But I want to talk about the actual story itself. So, first off, this is I'd say, very typical stylistic Hemingway story. Hemingway has a very distinct writing style. It is a sort of minimalist, direct, to-the-point writing style. There's very little elaboration, very little sort of explanation. It is straightforward and clean, might be a really good way of putting it. So I'll read you the first 6 paragraphs of this story. It will not take that long. Most of them are short paragraphs. They're dialogue. But you'll get a sense of how Hemingway writes in these very sort of clipped, efficient sentences, conveying really the broad ideas. So, this is the beginning. At the lakeshore, there was another rowboat drawn up. The two Indians stood waiting. Nick and his father got in the stern of the boat, and the Indians shoved it off, and one of them got in to row. Uncle George sat in the stern of the camp rowboat. The young Indian shoved the camp boat off and got in to row Uncle George. The two boats started off in the dark. Nick heard the oarlocks of the other boat quite a way ahead of them in the mist. The Indians rowed with quick, choppy strokes. Nick lay back with his father's arm around him. It was cold on the water. The Indian who was rowing them was working very hard, but the other boat moved further ahead in the mist all the time. "Where are we going, Dad?" Nick asked. "Over to the Indian camp. There's an Indian lady very sick." "Oh," said Nick. So again, you get this sense of Hemingway's style. It is these very sort of basic, functional descriptions. Minimalist, not a lot of elaboration, not a lot of explanation, etc., etc. And so that's something that Hemingway really pioneered. This was sort of one strand of modernist writing, modernist with a capital M. You had people like F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot is an American author who then becomes a British author. So you had these people in the 1920s, 30s, into the 40s, who were developing these kind of experimental writing styles, basically in response to World War I. And the U.S. experience of World War I was quite different than the British experience of World War I, for instance. So what's going on in British literature is in some ways more experimental, more chaotic, and so people like James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, they're writing things that are a bit more chaotic, a bit more difficult often than what Americans like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald are writing. But nonetheless, there is a clear stylistic break from sort of pre-World War I styles of writing. And this sort of clipped, minimalist approach is the voice that Hemingway pioneers and really gets. He becomes very, very successful doing this. And one of the things that it does, one of the things about this style that's very effective, in my view, is that it leaves a lot to the reader's imagination. And that's actually a thing we get toward the end of this essay. The end of this story, rather. So, the basic plot line of Indian Camp is Nick and his father, who's never given a name. He's just referred to as Nick's father or the father, his father. Nick calls him dad or daddy at different points. We don't ever find out his name. So that's a very interesting element. Hemingway seems to like characters without names, especially in his short stories. But Nick's father is a doctor, and he's brought over to this Native American camp, where a woman is in labor. She's been in labor for a couple of days. It seems to be that the baby has gone breech, and so he needs to perform a C-section. He does this successfully, but the husband of this woman actually ends up killing himself. He cuts his throat in the upper bunk of this bed. And so we get this bit of dialogue here toward the end of the story. Nick says, "Why did he kill himself, Daddy?" "I don't know, Nick. He couldn't stand things, I guess." "Do many men kill themselves, Daddy?" "Not very many, Nick." "Do many women?" "Hardly ever." "Don't they?" "Oh yes, they do sometimes." And again, I think this is vintage Hemingway style dialogue. But one of the things that's really striking about it is craft mirrors the content here, right? So Nick's father is unable to explain why this indigenous man commits suicide, and the story itself is unable to explain it. Right? It is this sort of let it be a mystery type moment. And I think that's one of the things that Hemingway's style, both in terms of the sort of the writing style itself, his writing voice, but also the way that he approaches content and what he gives us in his narratives, it often builds this sense of the world is a strange and mysterious place. We can't know what is going on. And so there's not much need to try. We simply accept the world as it is. We accept that it is mysterious. We accept that it is strange and inexplicable. And in this sort of stoic, manly, almost like Teddy Roosevelt style. I don't know if that makes sense to anybody else, but Teddy Roosevelt had this sort of public image, especially after leading the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War, of this like tough outdoorsman who was not the sort of it wasn't that he was like the individualist cowboy that people like Ronald Reagan would later romanticize. But it was this very like, when a job needs to be done, I will step up and do it approach to toughness. And it is worth noting that with Teddy Roosevelt, that often meant when a job involves making life better for those around me. When a job involves, for instance, social uplift through government action, etc., etc. But that's not the point of this story. But I get that sort of sense from Hemingway that he purposefully cultivates that kind of persona, both through his writing voice, through the content he writes about, and in his personal/public life. Right, the public persona that Hemingway creates for himself seems to me to very much be rooted in this: I am a man's man. I will do the things that need to be done, etc., etc. And I think we get that sense here. Again, this I don't need to understand the things that are difficult in the world, the things that are difficult to understand. I don't need to understand them. I can accept them because that's what it means to be a man, this sort of thing. But there's one other point I want to talk about in this essay, or in this short story, rather. So we get this point shortly after they arrive at this camp. So the father says, "This lady is going to have a baby, Nick," he said. "I know," said Nick. "You don't know," said his father. "Listen to me. What she's going through is called being in labor. The baby wants to be born, and she wants it to be born. All her muscles are trying to get the baby born. That is what is happening when she screams." "I see," Nick said. Just then the woman cried out, and these next two paragraphs are where it gets weird and interesting for me. "Oh, Daddy, can't you give her something to make her stop screaming?" asked Nick. "No, I haven't any anesthetic," his father said, "but her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important." Okay. Let's talk about that for a second. So first off, why don't you have any anesthetic? You're a doctor who's come to a medical emergency. Presumably, you knew that this was pregnancy-related. You knew that there might be some kind of problem where you would need to do a cesarean or something like that. Why didn't you bring any anesthetic? That seems like a really important thing if you are going to cut open a human being's abdomen to take out another smaller version of a human being. But you know what? It was the 20s. What do I know about it? So he has no anesthetic. So that seems to me like a bad start. But then her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important. I don't know what to make of this, but nothing that I can make of it is positive. I could read this a number of ways. Perhaps the most charitable is that this is the sort of numbing that sometimes occurs with people in the medical profession, right? Where you are inured to human suffering because it's such a ubiquitous component of that profession and that professional experience. And so human suffering does not move some physicians because they are so used to it. That's probably the most charitable approach to this. I also see a reading, and I'm somewhat inclined to believe this reading more, though this may deal with my own particular critical and philosophical views of it, that this is a dismissal of this human beings' pain because she is indigenous and because she's a woman. And I say that on the basis that there is a well-established history of the medical needs of minority groups in the U.S., whether those are indigenous people, whether those are African Americans, whether those are East Asians, South Asians, whatever it is, Hispanic people, whatever it is. There is a long history of the medical needs of ethnic and racial minorities being seen as less significant or insignificant, things that do not actually need to be addressed by people in the medical field. There is also a long history of women's medical needs and conditions being ignored or downplayed by predominantly male physicians. I don't know enough about Hemingway. I'm not a Hemingway scholar. I don't know enough about his sort of personal attitudes, personal views, to know whether we are supposed to read these two sentences, but her screams are not important. I don't hear them because they are not important, as a condemnation of this father, or an endorsement. I don't know what Hemingway is doing here, whether his project is a dismissal of this woman's pain, suffering, and general experience because she is an indigenous woman, or whether this is a critique of a system that dismisses her pain, suffering, and general experience because she's an indigenous woman.